Sorry for the delay in videos, I just got back from a family vacation, but I'm back at it today with another benchmarking video with 10 budget graphics cards in the Division 2. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome to Zach's Tech Turf. Today we're going to be benchmarking the Division 2 with 10 very popular budget graphics cards here in 2019 and with the new benchmarking CPU that you guys voted on. And if you're new here and you want to see more benchmarking or PC building videos, then hit that subscribe button down below and also that notification bell. That way you never miss an episode. But before we get into it, let me quickly pay some bills. Today's video is brought to you guys by our friends over at NordVPN. NordVPN is one of the highest rated VPNs or virtual private networks that allow you to browse the internet privately, securely, and with no history logs whatsoever. It's super easy to use. All you do is select which server from around the world you want to connect to and you're done. Enjoy clutch features like double VPN protection for extra security, an internet kill switch for the very rare time the VPN disconnects, super fast peer-to-peer downloads, and unlimited bandwidth for just $3 a month. I actually signed up for a year of NordVPN at full retail price way before they hooked me up with a referral link and a discount code for you guys, so I obviously recommend them as my go-to VPN service. Head on over to nordvpn.com/Zach or click the first link in the description to learn more. Alright, so before getting into the intro of these graphics cards, talking about my new CPU for benchmarking, or talking about the method for benchmarking this game, if you don't care about any of that and you just want to see the results, then feel free to skip to this time frame in the video. If not, then starting with the AMD cards, today we have the HD 7850, RX 460, RX 570, and the RX 480. For our NVIDIA cards, I have the GTX 750 Ti, GTX 960, GTX 970, GT 1030, GTX 1050 Ti, and finally the GTX 1060. For our testing platform, this rig is rocking a fresh Ryzen 3 2200G, which I'll talk about in just a second, 16GB of DDR4 RAM clocked at 3000 MHz, and the Division 2 is installed on a budget 120GB inline SSD. I really like the Ryzen 3 2200G for this testing. It doesn't really bottleneck our more powerful cards like the RX 480, but I kind of messed up because this motherboard is an X370, so there's no HDMI or DisplayPort here, so I can't really test the integrated graphics. I'll have to look into this a bit further. I'm not sure if I can somehow disable the discrete graphics of a card but continue to use the physical port, but for right now we'll just have to go without testing the built-in graphics. I'm sorry. With all that out of the way, the benchmarking method that I used was with the built-in benchmarking tool, which I found to produce similar results as actually playing the game, but one thing to note is that I did actually tend to get about 3 to 5 FPS more when actually playing the game compared to the benchmark. Another thing worth mentioning is that the beginning of this benchmark produced some nasty stutters in a lot of these cards, which you'll see in just a minute, and I tend to not get those nasty stutters when actually playing the game. For some more settings, I did turn on DirectX 12 for every single card because Hardware Unbox already put in the legwork and determined that it runs better with that, and I also turned on the reduced latency mode because it didn't really affect performance. For those of you that want to see how each of these cards compare side by side, here's a chart for every card with the exact same settings, 1080p, low, and with a resolution scale of 100%, not 75% FYI. As you can see here, the GT 1030 definitely struggled to keep up with the other cards, and the 750 Ti didn't perform that well either. Another thing to note is that the RX 570 actually performed better than the 480 for this test, but not with the next test, which we'll get to later. And now it's time to benchmark each of these cards individually. Just remember that the settings that you're about to see for each of these cards are the settings that I would personally recommend, but you can obviously tweak those to your liking. Starting with the NVIDIA cards, the first card up was the GTX 750 Ti, and in 1080p with low settings, but with the scale set to 75%, here I averaged 45 frames per second. Usually I aim for 50 FPS, but in my opinion, it wasn't worth lowering to 720p because this was smooth enough for me. Next up was the GTX 960, and here I used the same settings as our chart, 1080p low and 100%, and with this I got an average of 56 frames per second. Following that was the GTX 970, and its beautiful 3.5GB of VRAM, and in 1080p and medium settings I got a 73 FPS average. 73 is higher than what I usually aim for, but I didn't want to crank the settings up too high because this game definitely likes the VRAM, and we're pretty limited with the 3.5GB. Next up was the super budget GT 1030, and for this one I unfortunately had to drop it all the way down to 720p and low, and I still only got an average of 36. Those insane lows were actually replicated when playing the game and not just with the benchmark, so this card is honestly kind kind of unplayable with this game at this point in time. The GTX 1050 Ti was up next, and in 1080p and medium settings I got an average of 51 FPS, but I definitely still had some of those choppy 0.1% lows, which I wasn't too happy about. And finally, for our last NVIDIA card, the GTX 1060 was at the plate, and here in 1080p and medium settings, again I got an average of 61 FPS, and just like the previous card, I got some awful lows which didn't make this a fun experience. I guess you could drop these two cards down to low settings if you wanted to, but results like this really make it clear that this game favors AMD graphics cards. Speaking of which, the first AMD card on my run was the HD 7850, and in 1080p and low settings with a 75% resolution scale, I got a 56 FPS average. Pretty crazy just how well this super old card is still running with games here in 2019. Make sure you check out my dedicated video on this thing if you haven't already. Next up was the RX 460, and in 1080p and low settings with a 100% resolution scale, I got an FPS average of 65. After that, I tested my brand new RX 570, which actually gave me the Division 2 for free, so I'm super excited about that. And here in 1080p and high settings, I got a very respectable 66 FPS average. Definitely looks like the Division 2 likes that extra VRAM with this one. And finally, the last card on my run was the RX 480, and with the same settings as the 570, this card did slightly better with a 68 FPS average. Pretty interesting considering it lost to the 570 in the previous chart comparison. Well, there you have it. That wraps up the Division 2 benchmarks with some budget graphics cards. Make sure you guys let me know down in the comment section what you think of my new testing rig, and after that, feel free to head on over to one of these two videos if you haven't seen them yet, and definitely hit the subscribe button because coming up next, I'm reviewing this thing. You don't want to miss that video.